Our next topic this morning is on the new trends and emerging standards in cybersecurity, and it's being presented by Judy Burnthorn of the Deutsch, Kerrigan & Stiles firm in New Orleans. Judy has tried commercial matters before juries, judges, and arbitrators for 25 years, including defending securities and commodities fraud lawsuits brought against brokers and sellers of securities, involving allegations of misrepresentations and omissions of fact, failure to supervise, churning, unauthorized trading, selling away, and unsuitability. She has obtained outstanding results defending financial institutions in matters brought by investors, borrowers, depositors, employees, and the federal government. Please join me in welcoming Judy Burnthorn.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. This is a very hot topic, and I've been in constant communication with Ed and Ellis, and Larry has been wonderful because things have been changing right up until the last minute, and I've been changing everything to correspond. So let's get a good picture going here. My husband and my law partners tell me that I always seem to be able to work a dog into every presentation that I make. This is the one for this presentation, and it really, please indulge me, it really is relevant. Some of you might know who this is. If you don't know who this is Tinkerbell, and Tinkerbell is the pet chihuahua of Paris Hilton. Paris had an iPhone back in 2005 before we even knew about iPhones, and no, it was a smartphone. And so Paris and Tinkerbell had a hacking incident that happened to them early on. There was a 17-year-old hacker, and he was following Paris Hilton, knew a lot about her, saw Tinkerbell on TV all the time. Paris had a T-Mobile cell phone, and so this 17-year-old fellow went on to the T-Mobile website, guessed that Paris's password was Tinkerbell, and guessed right. He changed her password. T-Mobile had additional security provisions so that once the password was changed, an email would spit out to Paris's telephone, and she would get an email saying, "Your password has been changed." The 17-year-old outsmarted Paris in this regard because he called her saying, "I'm from T-Mobile. We're having technical difficulties. We think a whole bunch of people just got an email saying the password was changed." Paris said, "Yes, absolutely, that did happen," and gave the details to this 17-year-old. Paris ended up losing to the 17-year-old who accessed her cell phone, all of her contacts, people like Vin Diesel. All of these people were scurrying about trying to change their telephone number because their personal information had been posted on the internet, and additionally some racy photos of Paris made their way to the internet as well. And this is one episode of hacking that has happened. It's an episode that's sort of embarrassing, but maybe not so serious. Things get more serious from there, though. We just heard last month that there was a hacking episode that happened with respect to a whole series of banks, and one of them was JP Morgan. In that hacking incident, checking and savings account information was taken, and the speculation about that incident was that it was perpetrated by Russian hackers, maybe in retaliation for the sanctions that have been imposed by the United States against Russia. So things can get much more serious than just embarrassment. There's also in the hacking scene, there's actually a positive side to hacking, and that sounds surprising, but one thing that I did find is that back in June of 2010, there was a hacking incident that had been reported by a company. It's a security company that's located in Belarus. And it reported that it had located worms on many computers in Iran. This turned out to be a worm that would implant itself in the computers at the nuclear facilities of the Iranian government, and the centrifuges were controlled by these computers. This worm would cause the centrifuges to speed up and stop at random times, and this was very, very hard on the centrifuges. It additionally caused them to operate at a speed that was too fast on a normal basis outside the framework and guidelines for the centrifuges. This caused the destruction of some centrifuges altogether, and others were severely damaged. The estimate was that this put the Iranian effort toward a nuclear bomb back 12 to 18 months. So that's the only example that I could find of a positive hacking episode. I did see that in Saudi Arabia back in 2012, there was an incident where a virus attacked computers of the Saudi Arabian national oil producer, and 30,000 computers were infected by this virus. The virus destroyed the files on the hard drive of the computers, and instead of the files that were there before, the computer would display burning American flags. So there have also been episodes in the United States. There was one incident with respect to Twitter. Back in April of 2013, hackers were able to access AP, the Associated Press's Twitter account, and they posted a tweet saying that the White House had been bombed and President Obama had been injured. That stayed on the AP line for several minutes, so it did affect the markets for at least several minutes. So these are some of the episodes that have happened. You can see that it's a lot more serious than just Tinkerbell, and that some really serious consequences to the economic situation can occur. There's also embarrassing situations that can happen to some of these cybersecurity firms. There was one firm named H.B. Gary, and H.B. Gary is a security company, and it produces software that's designed to protect computers, and it also sells its services in order to make sure that computer networks are safe. H.B. Gary had been hired and was trying to track down the people who had caused the MasterCard website to crash. And there's a hacking group that's known as Anonymous. Anonymous found out that this security firm was on the trail, and Anonymous struck first and actually broke into all the servers of the H.B. Gary firm, stole emails, published the emails, destroyed data, and defaced the website. So some of these people are very sophisticated. Do any of you watch the cable show Homeland? Are you familiar with what I'm talking about? Homeland had a prime illustration of what may happen in a hacking incident, or very serious hacking incident. Take a look at this.
Dick Cheney spoke with 60 Minutes, and everybody is talking about this part of the interview that I'm about to play for you guys. This is truly unbelievable. Listen.
Now to a stunning case of art imitating life this morning. Anybody who's seen the hit show Homeland will remember that extraordinary scene where the vice president is murdered when somebody hacks into his pacemaker. Now a real-life former vice president says he feared exactly the same sort of attack. Here's ABC's Dan Kleffler.
Last season of the Showtime hit Homeland ended with a shocking assassination plot.
His pacemaker can be wirelessly accessed with that number.
Thankfully, a work of fiction. But in an interview with CBS News, the very non-fictional former Vice President Dick Cheney says the vulnerability is all too real.
I was aware of the danger, if you will, that existed.
When Cheney had a device regulating his heartbeat implanted in 2007, doctors disabled the wireless functionality, fearing a terrorist could hack the VP's heart remotely. Ring a bell?
I'm killing you. I knew from the experience we'd had and the necessity for adjusting my own device that it was an accurate portrayal of what was possible.
So, could it actually be possible to hack into such devices like a pacemaker? The FDA addressed those fears in August after the mysterious death of hacker Barnaby Jack, who claimed to have proof medical devices could be hacked. In a statement, the FDA said there is no cause for alarm for the nearly 3 million Americans who have pacemakers, and that the agency is not aware of any patient injuries or deaths associated with these incidents.
I didn't find any illustrations of deaths from hacking incidents either, but what I did find when I was looking through the literature is that there have actually been research studies performed indicating that pacemakers certainly can be controlled remotely, and in some instances, a charge administered or the battery diminished by continuing to run. Additionally, there were studies that indicated that fetal monitors that had been placed on women who have high-risk pregnancies, they were in the intensive care ward, those fetal monitors were able to be accessed remotely and controlled by a hacker. The third thing that was one of the experiments that the researchers did was to check insulin pumps, and I know many of you might have diabetes, but an insulin pump was able to be accessed remotely by a hacker if that person was within 100 feet of the person who has the insulin pump. So these are very serious incidents economically, to our life, to our limb. What is being done in the international scene, the national scene, and with respect to state governments to protect us and our companies. In this instance, the European Union is really out far ahead of the United States because they've had privacy legislation for quite some time. There is no comprehensive federal statute on these issues. The main regulation is by states. There are 47 different statutes that makes compliance very difficult, but what these statutes say is that when the private information of a person or entity is received by an unauthorized person, notice has to be given. Very few of these statutes create a private cause of action. They require, what ties them all together is that they all define personal information, and usually personal information is your name and some number. It might be your social security number, your driver's license number, your passport number. Most states go in that definition of personal information. There's an expanded definition of personal information that some states have adopted that gives more protection to the users, and that involves biometric information, so that even information like a fingerprint, if it's accessed by somebody, can provoke the requirement for notice. Or in some situations, a handwriting signature, that's biometric information that if it's accessed requires, the statute kicks in and notice is required. Also like facial recognition technology, so your face is now measured by a computer. If that is accessed and distributed to somebody who's unauthorized, then the company who permitted that breach might have the obligation to give a notice. The notice is usually required to be given to the user, but also sometimes to other parties. Here in New York, it has to be given to the state police, the Attorney General, and the New York Department of State. In terms of timing, many of the statutes say that this notice has to be given at the most expedient time, but with no unreasonable delay, and many times there is a deadline of 45 days put on that. Many times the content of the notice is specified. I look just because I'm in New York to see what's going on in New York and New Jersey, and when you read the New York statute, you'll see that it applies to information that's acquired by an unauthorized person. But if you look at the New Jersey statute, it says that it applies to information that is accessed by an unauthorized person. So access might be a little easier to do than acquire. Does acquire mean download? I didn't see any cases under that, but it looks like the New Jersey law is a lot more broad. There are scattered federal statutes on this issue, many in the medical arena, many in the financial arena. The FTC Act has been used many times by the FTC to bring enforcement actions with the FTC alleging that the failure to use adequate security measures is an unfair trade practice. In February of 2014, President Obama issued an executive order, and he required the Federal National Institute of Standards and Technology to formulate best practices that would not be binding on any particular industry, but it's thought that they may end up being a standard of care type thing. With respect to the SEC and FINRA, there's a wealth of information that's on Larry Polk's website at the Sutherland firm. He has examples of enforcement actions and is sending out alerts. I've been getting the alerts almost every week. But in this in this regard, the SEC on April 15th, 2014, said that it's going to be examining broker-dealers and investment advisors on cybersecurity issues. The SEC promulgated and published a document request that's a sample document request, and it's going to be asking for these types of documents with respect to the examination that it does of the broker-dealers and the investment advisors. There are several different categories in the document request. It relates to identification of risks and cybersecurity governance, things like you have to have a written policy. Do you have cyber insurance? Also, do your IT members have job descriptions? With respect to protection of firm networks, do you have passwords? Do you have destruction policies for documents? And do you train your employees? Risks associated with remote customer access may relate to customer authentication procedures, and how do you detect unusual transactions? So all of those things may be looked at by the SEC in these sweeping examinations. There's also been a whole series of enforcement actions, and like I said, they're very well summarized on Larry's website. They relate to all kinds of different areas. For instance, written policies. You can't just say, in one case, the policy said we require all employees to secure all private information. That's not enough. You can't say try to secure it. It has to be a mandate. Basically, a lot of these enforcement actions fall in the area of firms that hired consultants but then did not adopt the suggestions of the consultants. It might be a good idea, if one is hired, to go ahead and take their recommendations. And encryption is also something that the SEC has focused on. Now, FINRA has indicated that it's going to be doing the very same thing as the SEC. FINRA has, on January 2nd, 2014, issued its priorities for the year, and it said our primary focus is the integrity of firms' policies, procedures, and controls to protect sensitive customer data. FINRA's evaluation of such controls may take the form of examinations and targeted investigations. Now, if you end up not in an examination or an enforcement action, but a private litigation, you're going to need to know what the authorities are out there. I don't have time to go through each one of these with you, but in the materials I've given you the cases that show the private causes of action that have been stated, and there's a lot of defense cases in there you can cite and a couple of plaintiffs' cases. If you're doing a private case and you're being sued for a cyber breach, you're going to want to start with standing under the United States U.S. Supreme Court Clapper decision, but there are also cases saying that a cyber breach, just because there's a breach and there's a future threat of some identity theft, unless there's actual damage, that person who's filing that lawsuit might not have standing, number one, and might not have any damage. In the Starbucks case, the case was dismissed. Standing did exist, but there was no damage. I have in the materials also gone over with you all the coverage issues that might exist under existing policies that you may try to get coverage under for a breach. Those include CGL policies. There are some classic issues that run across all kinds of CGL litigation, and I've given you both plaintiff and defense cases in the materials. Now there's cyber insurance on the market, and I've also given you several factors that you can look at with respect to the new cybersecurity policies that tell you what to look for in a cyber insurance policy if you're buying a specialty policy. There's a lot of information. I hope you can get what you need from the materials. Thank you very much. And one more thing I have to get to. I have one more dog to say goodbye. My English Bulldog has to make it into the program. Thank you very much.